The sun was setting low over Rosario, painting the sky in quiet gold, the kind that doesn't rush to fade. Lionel drove with the windows down, his hand resting on the steering wheel, the warm air carrying that familiar scent of home, dust, grass, and memory. He hadn't been here in years. Not like this. Not alone. The city had changed. Taller buildings, new roads, brighter lights. But the air still felt the same. Honest. Heavy with stories. Every corner he passed held a shadow of the boy he used to be, running with a ball too big for his feet and dreams too big for this town. When he turned onto the narrow road leading to the old stadium, his chest tightened. The gate was still there, chipped paint, rusted hinges, and that faint echo of laughter that never really left. He parked the car, sat still for a moment, and just looked. It wasn't Camp Nou. It wasn't Paris. It wasn't Miami. It was where it started. He got out slowly, gravel crunching under his shoes. The light of the sunset spilled across the field beyond the fence, stretching long and soft over the grass that had grown uneven and wild. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old key, the same one his father had kept all those years ago. The metal was dull, but it still fit the lock. When he turned it, the gate creaked open, the sound breaking the silence like an old friend's sigh. Inside, everything was smaller than he remembered. The stands, the goalposts, even the sky. But the feeling, that quiet pulse in his chest, was exactly the same. He walked to the edge of the field, stopped, and watched the sun dip lower behind the bleachers. The world looked older, softer. He whispered, barely audible, "Hola, viejo amigo." And for the first time in a long while, the silence answered back. The sun had almost disappeared now, leaving only that deep orange glow that makes everything look like a memory. The empty stadium stretched before him, quiet, gentle, forgotten by time, but still alive in its own way. Lionel walked slowly along the edge of the field. The grass brushed against his shoes, uneven and dry in places. In the distance, a goalpost leaned slightly to one side, its paint cracked and peeling. He smiled faintly. It had once looked so tall. Now it seemed small, fragile even, like a monument built by dreams rather than metal. He could still hear the voices in his mind, the laughter of his childhood teammates, the whistle of the coach, his father's shout from the stands. "Vamos, Leo." It all came back, not as sharp flashes, but as soft waves. The kind that don't hurt anymore, just remind you of who you were. He climbed a few rows up into the stands, each step creaking under his weight. Dust rose with every movement, catching the last bits of sunlight. From here, the view was familiar. The whole field, the track around it, the small locker room at the far end. This was his first universe, a small world where everything had once felt infinite. Sitting down on the top row, he rested his elbows on his knees, looking out at the field below. The sound of the city hummed faintly in the background. Cars, laughter, distant music. Life went on out there, fast and loud. But here, inside these walls, time had stopped. He thought about how many stadiums he had played in since. Giants filled with light, roaring crowds, fireworks, pressure. Thousands of people chanting his name. And yet none of them felt like this. Here, there was no noise, no weight, no expectation. Just grass, air, and the echo of who he once was. A gust of wind passed through, stirring the dust at his feet. For a second, it almost looked like ghosts running across the field, small, fast, full of hope. He closed his eyes, listening to that invisible game play out in his mind. He didn't miss the glory. He missed the silence that came before it. And as the sun finally sank below the stands, leaving the field in shadow, he whispered, not to the world, not even to himself, but to the boy who had once stood here barefoot, staring at the same sky. "You made it, kid." Darkness began to spread slowly across the field, that soft kind of twilight that makes everything feel both alive and gone at once. The air had cooled, carrying the faint smell of wet soil and old grass. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then silence again, pure and heavy. Lionel made his way down from the stands and crossed the track toward the far bench. The wood was chipped, the paint long faded to gray. He brushed off a layer of dust with his hand and sat down, the creek beneath him breaking the stillness. This was the same spot. He remembered it instantly. The place where he used to wait for his turn to play, his legs swinging restlessly, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the field like it was the whole world. Now, sitting there again, it all felt smaller, but deeper. The field no longer looked like a dream he had to reach. It looked like a memory he had finally returned to. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching the faint outlines of the goalposts disappear into shadow. His mind wandered back to a moment he hadn't thought of in years, that day his father had walked him here for the first time. He could still remember the way the man's hand rested on his shoulder, the quiet pride in his voice as he said, "One day, you'll make them all stand up for you." And he had. The whole world had. But now, here, there was no one left to stand. No lights, no noise, no cameras. Just him, the man who had lived that dream to its end, sitting in the silence where it all began. He picked up a handful of dry grass, rubbing it between his fingers. It crumbled instantly. Time does that, he thought. Turns everything you once ran across into something fragile enough to fall apart in your hands. But maybe that was okay. Maybe that was what peace looked like. The wind shifted again, bringing with it a distant echo, the sound of a ball being kicked, faint and imaginary. He smiled without looking up. "Still playing, huh?" he murmured softly, as if the ghosts could hear him. Then he leaned back on the bench, eyes tracing the horizon where the last line of orange light was fading. The night wasn't lonely. It was honest. And for the first time in a long while, Lionel Messi didn't feel like a man chasing time. He felt like someone who had finally caught up with it. The first stars began to appear above the stadium, small, uncertain dots scattered across a deepening blue. The floodlights, long broken, stood like old sentinels, watching over what used to be a dream. Messi tilted his head back, letting the cool air fill his lungs. The silence was total now, but it wasn't empty. It was full of something softer, memory, maybe, or gratitude. He walked slowly toward the center of the field, his steps barely making a sound on the worn grass. Every few meters, he could see faint white lines, the ghost of the pitch markings still clinging to the earth. He remembered running over them barefoot, chasing a ball that seemed to always roll just a little too far ahead. Back then, he believed if he just ran fast enough, the world would open up. Now, standing where the center circle once was, he closed his eyes. He could almost feel it, the echo of shouts, the thud of a ball, the heartbeat of a game that had shaped his life. His hands hung loosely at his sides, his shoulders relaxed. For the first time, he didn't feel like he needed to score. He didn't need to win anything. He looked down at the ground, kicked a small stone, watched it roll a few meters away. The sound it made when it stopped was the only sound for miles. That, he thought, is what peace sounds like. He sat down right there in the center of the field, legs crossed, the grass cool beneath his palms. The air carried the faint sound of crickets and the whisper of wind against metal bleachers. He remembered being 12, the smell of his worn-out cleats, the way his father's voice echoed from the stands, the promise he'd made to himself. "I'll never stop until I make it." He smiled faintly. He had kept that promise. Maybe too well. For years, he'd been running. From one city to another, one jersey to the next, one victory into another silence. But here, in this small, forgotten stadium, he realized something that no trophy or anthem had ever taught him. He didn't need to keep running anymore. He lay back slowly, eyes fixed on the stars. They seemed closer now, almost reachable. He whispered to the night, barely audible, "I made it, but I missed the boy who didn't know he would." The wind moved gently through the tall grass, and for a moment, it almost felt like that boy was still running, somewhere just beyond the light. The sky had turned completely dark now, and the only light left came from the orange glow of the nearby street lamps, sneaking in through the gaps in the fence. It painted long shadows across the field, soft, slow-moving ghosts of the past. Lionel stood up, brushing the dirt off his hands, and walked toward the edge of the pitch where the locker rooms used to be. The building was still there, small, made of old concrete, the paint flaking off the walls. He pushed the door open, and it groaned like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and memory. The benches were cracked, the metal hooks on the walls empty and rusted. A broken mirror hung by one nail, reflecting just enough of the dim light to make the room feel alive again. He walked to the same corner where he used to sit, that narrow space at the end of the bench, his spot. He could almost see the other kids crowding around, pulling on their jerseys, laughing, arguing, shouting about who'd score first. He smiled, remembering how quiet he'd always been back then. Just a small kid tying his shoelaces tighter than anyone else, whispering something to himself before running out. He closed his eyes and tried to remember what that whisper was. It came back slowly, like a forgotten melody. "Please, let them see me." He said it out loud this time, almost laughing. The sound echoed faintly off the walls, soft and human. It wasn't a plea anymore, not for approval, not for recognition. It was a thank you. He walked over to one of the lockers and ran his fingers over the rusted nameplate. The letters were gone, but he remembered exactly where his used to be. Lionel Messi, tiny and printed by a coach who had no idea what that name would one day mean. He crouched down, opening the locker door. It squeaked but didn't resist. Inside, there was nothing, just dust and a few scraps of old tape. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, a folded photo, edges worn, corners creased. It was him, 10 years old, standing on this same field, hair messy, socks too big, smiling at something just out of frame. His father had taken it that morning before his first match. He stared at it for a long moment, thumb tracing the edge of his own younger face. Then he placed it gently inside the locker and closed the door. Not to hide it, to leave it where it belonged. When he stepped outside again, the air felt cooler. The stadium was darker now, quieter, but not lonely. The boy in the picture was still here, running through the grass, chasing something that didn't need to be caught anymore. And Messi, the man who found him again, finally let him go. He walked back out into the open air, letting the door swing shut behind him. The click of the old lock echoed faintly in the quiet, like the closing of a story. The night had deepened. The sky was now a dark blue canvas sprinkled with stars. The air was still, almost reverent. Lionel made his way back to the field, his steps slower this time. He stopped at the edge of the grass, then crouched down and ran his hand over it. Rough, cool, alive. The smell of earth filled his lungs. It wasn't perfect turf like the ones he'd played on for years. It was uneven, dotted with weeds, wild and real. It felt honest. He sat down right there, on the ground, cross-legged like he used to as a kid when practice ended too late, and he was too tired to walk home. The silence around him was thick but peaceful, almost sacred. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the city far away and the slow rhythm of his own breathing. For a moment, he just listened. To everything and nothing. It felt like the world had paused just for him. He thought about the boy who used to sit here, staring up at the same stars, believing that the world beyond Rosario was too far to ever reach. And yet, somehow, that same boy had crossed oceans, filled stadiums, carried nations, and found the very edges of his own dream. It was strange, how reaching everything could still leave you longing for something small. Not for the spotlight, or the noise, or even the game itself, but for this silence, this stillness, the moment before everything began. He leaned back on his hands, eyes half closed, feeling the cool air against his face. Somewhere deep in his chest, that old familiar heartbeat, the one that used to race before every match, returned, steady and slow. He smiled. Not the smile of victory, not the one the world had memorized, but a private one, small, quiet, honest. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through the grass, carrying the sound of a flag fluttering somewhere high above. He looked up at the pole near the gate. The flag was gone, but the rope still swayed gently. He whispered to the field, to the stars, to no one in particular. "I thought I came back to say goodbye." Then, softer, almost to himself, "Maybe I came back to remember how to start again." The night didn't answer. It didn't need to. The night had settled completely now, calm, wide, endless. The air hung heavy with that familiar scent of dew and cut grass, though no one had mowed this field in years. Messi stood slowly, brushing the dirt off his jeans, and began to walk toward the sideline where the old storage shed still leaned against the fence. He remembered how, as a boy, he used to sneak in there to borrow extra balls when practice was over. The door always jammed, but he'd learned how to push it just right with his shoulder. He tried it again now, the same push, the same creak. The wood groaned open, as if recognizing him. Inside, it smelled of dust, metal, and years gone by. The light from outside spilled in through a crack in the roof, cutting across the room like a narrow spotlight. Piles of forgotten things lay everywhere. Broken cones, tangled nets, a deflated ball. He picked it up, turning it in his hands. The leather was rough, peeling in places. He smiled. It wasn't just a ball, it was the weight of time itself. The same kind of ball he used to juggle for hours until his feet hurt and his mother would call him home. He set it down in the middle of the floor and gave it a light tap with his foot. It rolled a few inches, hit the wall, and stopped. The dull sound it made was strangely comforting. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in that darkness, he could almost hear it again. The rhythm of his childhood, the bounce of the ball, the scrape of his shoes, his father's laugh echoing from the gate. It wasn't the roar of 90,000 people, it was better. It was the sound of beginning. He opened his eyes, exhaled slowly, and looked around the shed once more. On a dusty shelf near the back, he noticed a small object, a whistle, old and rusted. He picked it up, wiped it against his sleeve, and held it to his lips. The sound that came out was weak, shaky, barely a whistle at all. But it was enough. Enough to make him laugh quietly, the kind of laugh that's part joy, part ache. He placed it back down carefully, almost like returning a relic to its rightful place. Then he stepped outside again. The cool air met him like a soft wave. The stars were brighter now, and somewhere beyond the field, the faint hum of Rosario's nightlife carried on. Cars, music, people laughing. The world kept moving. Messi looked back at the shed, the field, the stands, and thought. This was where everything had started, and somehow, it was still teaching him something. He whispered to himself, voice low and steady. You never really outgrow where you learn to dream. And as he began walking back toward the car, he realized, tonight, he hadn't come here to remember what he lost. He'd come to see what had never left. When he reached the car, he didn't open the door right away. Instead, he leaned against it, staring out at the field one more time. The stadium lights were long gone, but the moon had taken their place, soft, silver, calm. It spilled across the grass, catching every uneven patch, every line of shadow. Lionel crossed his arms and just stood there, breathing it in. He could feel the night pressing close, quiet, patient, kind. Somewhere beyond the fence, a streetlight flickered, insects buzzed in the distance, and a train passed faintly far away. The whole world seemed to whisper, but not to him, around him. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small item wrapped in paper, the captain's armband from one of his earliest matches. He had kept it all these years, tucked away like something sacred. The colors had faded, and the fabric had frayed, but it still carried the weight of everything that followed. He turned it over in his hands for a while. It wasn't pride he felt. It wasn't sadness either. It was something in between, the kind of emotion that doesn't have a name because it doesn't need one. He walked back toward the fence, knelt down, and carefully set the armband on the ground by the gate. It wasn't an offering, not a goodbye, just a small, quiet thank you. For every morning he had come here half asleep and full of dreams. For every bruise that had meant progress. For every day he believed that the world started and ended with this field. He brushed the dirt from his hands and looked up at the moon again. Its light fell on the stands, the benches, the locker room, all the places that had shaped him. For a moment, it almost looked alive again, as if the past was still breathing just under the surface. He smiled, slow and small. He could still see that boy, barefoot, determined, chasing a ball too big for him. And he didn't want to erase him anymore. That boy had done his part. Messi turned toward his car, his shoes crunching softly on the gravel. But just as he reached for the door, he paused and looked back one last time. The field shimmered faintly under the moonlight, silent but full of life. He whispered, "You gave me everything, and I hope I gave you something back." Then, almost instinctively, he raised his hand. Not a wave, not a farewell, but something gentler. A salute to the place that had made him whole. The night accepted it quietly, folding the gesture into its stillness. The road leaving the stadium was narrow and lined with tall trees, their shadows stretching long under the streetlights. Messi drove slowly, one hand on the wheel, the window rolled down. The night air slipped through, cool, quiet, carrying the scent of dust and eucalyptus. It smelled like his childhood. He didn't play music. The silence was its own kind of song, steady, soft, familiar. The hum of the engine filled the space between thoughts. For once, there was no rush to get anywhere, no match to prepare for, no cameras waiting. just the sound of tires on old pavement and the rhythm of his own breathing. He passed through the outskirts of Rosario, the small houses with their lights still on, laundry hanging in backyards, dogs barking lazily at passing cars. Every street felt like it had a story, corners where he'd once dribbled a ball, walls that still had the faded marks of his practice shots. The city hadn't forgotten him, but tonight, it didn't seem to recognize him either. And somehow, that felt right. He stopped at a red light near a corner store. An older man stood outside smoking, watching the street like someone who'd seen it all 1,000 times. Their eyes met for just a second. The man smiled, not in awe, not in surprise, just a simple, knowing smile, like two people acknowledging something they both understood. Messi nodded back, then the light turned green. He drove on. After a few blocks, he pulled over beside a small park. The same one where he used to play when the stadium gates were locked, where his mother would call him in when it got dark. The swings were still there, creaking gently in the wind. He got out of the car and sat on one of the benches. The wood was cold beneath him. A stray cat crossed the path, disappearing into the bushes. Somewhere nearby, a radio played faintly from a window, an old tango, soft and distant. He leaned back and closed his eyes. He could almost see it again. The boy on the swings, the laughter, the ball rolling into the street, the tiny, endless world that once held everything he needed. A small smile crept across his face. He whispered to the air, "You did good, kid." And maybe, somewhere in that same wind, a faint echo answered, not in words, but in feeling. The kind of quiet pride that only comes from knowing you've lived your dream and somehow stayed yourself through it all. He sat there a while longer, watching the empty swings sway, before standing up and walking back to the car. The night no longer felt heavy. It felt alive, calm, full, and finally enough. By the time he got home, it was close to midnight. The streets were nearly empty, the kind of quiet that only comes after a long, hot day finally exhales. He parked outside the small house on the hill, the one that looked out over the city lights, and stayed in the car for a moment before stepping out. From here, Rosario looked like a galaxy spread across the earth. Tiny lights flickered everywhere, in windows, along roads, reflected in puddles left from an earlier drizzle. It reminded him of all the stadiums he'd stood in, the floodlights, the flashing cameras, the sea of faces. Except this was softer, humbler, real. He took off his jacket and slung it over his shoulder, walking toward the back garden. The air was cool, filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant sound of a train. He leaned against the fence and looked up at the stars. The same ones he'd seen from that field hours ago. The same ones he'd looked at as a boy when he dreamed of leaving this place. And now, after everything, they were still here. Unchanged. Maybe that was the point. Inside, the faint light from the kitchen spilled through the curtains. He could hear his wife moving around. Quiet, familiar sounds that always meant home. He smiled. The thought of waking the kids crossed his mind, but he decided against it. Some moments are meant to be carried quietly, not shared just yet. He sat down on the old wooden step outside the door, elbows on his knees, eyes still lifted toward the night sky. The field, the locker room, the smell of dust and grass, it all played back in his mind, one memory after another, until it no longer felt like the past. It just felt like him. He reached into his pocket and found a small pebble, the same one he'd picked up earlier from the field without even realizing it. He rolled it between his fingers, smiling at the thought. It was rough, ordinary, meaningless to anyone else. But to him, it was everything, a small piece of where it all began. He set it down on the railing beside him, a quiet reminder that not every souvenir needs to shine. Some are meant to stay dull, simple, honest. The city lights below shimmered faintly as the wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of rain. He breathed in deeply, let it out slowly, and whispered into the night. "I'm home." No stadium roar, no anthem, no cameras, just the hum of life, small, imperfect, and whole. And for the first time in years, Lionel Messi didn't feel like he was leaving something behind. He felt like he'd finally arrived. The next morning, sunlight crept slowly through the curtains, soft and golden. It painted the room in quiet warmth, the kind that doesn't wake you abruptly, but invites you back into the world gently. Messi opened his eyes and stayed still for a while, letting the light fill the silence. His body ached pleasantly, that familiar weight after long travel, but his mind felt lighter than it had in years. He turned his head and saw Antonella still asleep beside him, her hand resting loosely against his chest. For a moment, he just watched her breathe, steady, calm, the rhythm of normal life. Beyond the window, he could hear the city waking, car doors closing, birds chirping, a vendor calling out down the street. Rosario was alive again, and so was he. He slipped out of bed quietly and walked to the kitchen. The tiles were cool under his bare feet. On the table lay his phone, lighting up with messages, interviews, sponsors, training updates. He smiled faintly, pressed the screen off, and set it face down. Not today. He made coffee instead, the smell drifting through the house, rich and grounding. He stepped outside to the small patio with his mug, leaning against the railing. The morning air was fresh, still damp from the night's drizzle. From here, he could see the distant rooftops and, further beyond, a faint outline of the old stadium's floodlight towers on the horizon. Broken, rusted, barely visible, but still standing. He watched them for a long moment, sipping slowly. The image brought a quiet satisfaction, not nostalgia. It was like seeing an old friend from afar, someone you didn't need to speak to anymore, because you both already knew. He thought about that locker, the old ball, the whistle, the photo he'd left behind. Little offerings to a past that had carried him further than he could have imagined. And for the first time, he realized he didn't need to keep going back there. That part of him wasn't gone. It had simply grown roots elsewhere. In his family, in his peace, in the simple rhythm of a quiet morning. He set the cup down and took a deep breath, eyes still on the horizon. The city was glowing under the sun now, alive in a different kind of way. He smiled, soft and real. Behind him, a small voice called out, sleepy, curious. "Papa." He turned around. One of his sons stood there, hair messy, rubbing his eyes. Messi bent down, smiled, and opened his arms. The boy ran to him without hesitation. He lifted him up, holding him close, the way his father once did. The warmth of that small heartbeat against his chest said more than words ever could. "Where were you last night?" the boy mumbled. Messi hesitated, then said quietly, "Just visiting an old friend." The boy nodded, still half asleep, resting his head on his father's shoulder. And as Messi carried him inside, sunlight followed, spilling across the walls, the floor, and the quiet, steady life he had built. He didn't look back toward the stadium again. He didn't need to. Some places never leave you. They just learn to live where your heart is now. That evening, the world was slow again. The kind of evening where everything feels balanced, neither ending nor beginning, just there. The golden hour washed the house in soft amber light, flickering across the walls like a memory that refused to fade. Messi sat on the steps outside, barefoot, a small radio playing quietly beside him. His sons were in the yard, passing a ball between them. The smallest one kicking with clumsy precision, the older helping him line up his shots. Their laughter filled the air, bouncing between the walls and spilling out into the street. He didn't call out instructions. He didn't correct their form. He just watched, smiling, not as a player, not even as a father trying to teach, but as someone finally learning what peace really looks like. The ball rolled too far and stopped at his feet. He picked it up, spinning it once in his hands. It was newer, shinier, smoother than the ones from his childhood, but somehow, it felt exactly the same. He looked at his sons. "Again?" he asked. They nodded eagerly. He placed the ball down, gave it a light tap, and laughed when they chased after it. The sound of their footsteps echoed faintly, just like his had so many years ago on that dusty field. And for a brief moment, it felt like the past and present were sharing the same breath. As the sun sank lower, he leaned back on his elbows and looked up at the sky. The clouds were painted in orange and violet, and somewhere beyond them, the stars were waiting. The same stars that had watched a little boy in Rosario dream of something bigger. He thought of the stadium again, quiet, empty, still holding that old photograph, that whistle, that armband. It didn't feel far away. It felt right here, in the sound of laughter, in the smell of grass, in the rhythm of home. Antonella stepped outside, handing him a glass of water. "You're smiling," she said softly. He nodded. "Yeah, I think I finally understand why." She tilted her head. "Why what?" He looked at the boys, at the fading sun, at the sky that never stopped being the same, no matter how far he'd gone. Why it all mattered, he said simply. She smiled back, sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. Together, they watched as the last light slipped below the horizon. The world was quiet now, not empty, not lonely, just quiet. And for Lionel Messi, the greatest noise he'd ever known came not from the stadiums of the world, but from this. The soft sound of his children's laughter, carried gently by the evening breeze. For the first time in his life, the silence wasn't something he escaped. It was something he'd earned.